this is our presentation about the draft SPG on development and biodiversity. This is a new SPG. We haven't had one before. We thought it was really important to prioritise this as being one of the first SPG to support the adopted local development plan. One of the biggest reasons is that there's been a really significant shift in the planning context and the national framework over the last few years. And the planning process now is really interlinked with key concepts of biodiversity, green infrastructure. I don't know if you've heard terms like ecosystem services and ecosystem resilience. All these are things that are part of the movement to try and achieve and adapt to climate change, and so that these concepts are now embedded in the planning process. So because of this, it's all still relatively new in terms of how we apply this to planning decisions in the planning process. So it's really important to have some guidance for developers, decision makers, all those involved in the planning application process to understand what this actually means and how this shift in thinking can be embedded. So this document's been prepared as kind of a partnership. We've done it internally and it's been worked between the Nature Conservation team and our planning team in consultation with the development management team as well. So the idea was to try and get the two departments to understand each other's processes and ways of working and put that into one document. So just to justify why we need a biodiversity SPG, I'm sure you're all aware, but sometimes it's good to remind ourselves of the really high quality of natural environment that we do have in Swansea. And it really should be a key consideration in the determination of any application. You know, I mean, when you look at the screen, I try to do a cross section. We've got really rare species, marine species. We've got very important, internationally important designated landscapes. I think the statistic that we use quite often is that 80% of the county's total land area and over half of the county area is a significant ecological importance. So all our development decisions, not just those in the wider landscape, need to be taking this into account. The Environment Act has defined a list of species that are of ecological significance, and a lot of these are found within Swansea. So the SPG is helping both the council, applicants and their ecologists to navigate through all the implications and policy requirements of taking all of these ecological opportunities and constraints into account. So in Swansea, we're also in a really strong position to, we've got the really strong policy framework. The commitment to work with nature is already embedded in a lot of our policies. We declared a climate emergency back in 2019. At the regional level, the PSB has embedded the duty to maintain and enhance biodiversity into its local wellbeing plan. And also at the corporate level, our corporate plan has an objective, the working with nature, maintaining and enhancing natural resources and biodiversity is a key objective in our corporate plan. And then at the planning level, the recently adopted local development plan has got a suite of 3 policies which all relate to biodiversity, 2 of which are about designated habitats and species. But more importantly, we also have now a policy which recognises the importance of maintaining and enhancing networks and features. So that's more the cumulative scale. And also, I think it's important to say that these biodiversity policies sit within a wider framework of other LDP policies. Placemaking is a key concept in planning now, and that's about making a place that works across all different subjects. So we're looking at making sure development incorporates networks of green infrastructure, addresses health, well-being, air quality, water quality, impacts of flooding, and all these things work together. The biodiversity doesn't just work in isolation. So this the SPG also explains how the biodiversity sits within these other subjects. At the national level, there's been a shift in national legislation and national planning policy. The key legislation here is the Environment Wales Act, which brings in a duty on the council for all its functions to maintain and enhance biodiversity and in doing so promote the resilience of ecosystems. So this is right at the heart of everything we do, and one of the things that we need to do in this SPG is try and understand how that applies to planning policy. So some of the work of this is done already in that the Planning Policy Wales has been published, and that seeks to explain how this duty should be embedded in our planning decisions. Supporting this in the background, of course, is the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which has a goal for a resilient Wales. So I think the main thing to say is that this SPG is really trying to understand the need to shift our approach in decision making. I think perhaps we're all familiar with the concept of biodiversity, which is kind of more traditionally about conservation. I mentioned the two policies about protecting species and habitats. We're used to looking after what we've got and the impacts of what we do on the things we already have. But this concept of resilience, ecosystem resilience, it's more difficult to get to grips with, especially in a complex technical system like the planning system. So I think this slide here really helps to understand the difference. If you're just going for conservation, like it's an ego approach where we're sitting at the top, we're doing to the environment, and then we're going through the process to offset, which is a process we're probably used to, where we probably take away something through development, and then you try and put something back to make up for it. Instead, I think the key part of the Section 6 duty is more this duty to look at ecosystem resilience. So this is putting people within the whole system. Well, we are part of that ecosystem. We're not just at the top of the chain and managing the impacts. So this is where we've got to try and understand how to do this in the planning system. So the other thing that's really important is to understand that the impacts of what we do on a development site can occur at all scales. So the wider landscape, perhaps we're not used to thinking about that. We look at a site, what we've done on that site and within that site, but the connectivity of how species move within and outside a site to the wider landscape is a key thing that we've now got to try and bring into our decision making. So this can happen at the top level on a protected landscape, or we could also be thinking at the medium level at a green corridor. So are we including stepping stones within a site and outside of the site for species to move, to forage, to migrate, and to adapt to climate change? So the purpose of this SPG is to look at the guidance in the Environment Act and in Planning Policy Wales to maintain and enhance biodiversity and to promote resilient ecosystems. So to do this, we need to make sure there's no net loss, which is this idea of offsetting what we've done. So no significant loss to habitats or species. But the key part, which is going to help us achieve this resilience of ecosystems, is net benefit. So this means that we need to consider the impacts of the developments of all features of importance to biodiversity. So we're not just looking at those things that are protected and designated. We're looking at how things interact across the whole landscape and in that whole ecosystem. So the objective really is, after you have finished your development, you should leave it in a better ecological state than when you started, and not just put back what you might have taken. So in Planning Policy Wales, there is a very clear approach set out to how to achieve this, and it's called the Stepwise approach. So Chapter 3 of the SPG focuses on explaining exactly how we're going to do this. The principles are that you should firstly avoid, then move on to minimise and mitigate, and in the very last resort, you should be compensating. And in all cases, we should be trying to find some enhancement or uplift to the ecological state of the site. So I'll move through this in the next slide, but just to point out that we've gone a little bit further in our approach in the SPG to expand the stages set out in Planning Policy Wales to make sure that it's really clear how to respond to and design and integrate biodiversity in the earlier stages of the development, and also to understand those final stages to make sure we manage and monitor to get this right and secure over the long term of a development. So Chapter 4 of our SPG explains then how each of these stages of the stepwise process apply to each of the development plan stages. So something that we thought feel really strongly is important is to get things identified and integrated at a very early stage. So pre-application is really important. We want to be talking to people as early as we can in an application to understand what the impacts and the opportunities on the site are and get those addressed. We really shouldn't be in a state anymore of having it as an afterthought where we're trying to paste on mitigation measures late in the day. So each section of Chapter 4 goes through in detail how we expect an applicant and their decision maker to be thinking about each of the steps. So the first stage is to assess. So that's a lot to do with ecological surveys and assessments, and there's a lot of guidance in our appendices to show exactly the best practice of how to go about this. And one of the key things about getting in there at an early stage is that developers can cost for the interventions that they're going to put in if they know early on that these are going to be required. The next stages are to mitigate and, oh sorry, I think I missed one out. Yeah, so if you've identified, you can then avoid wherever possible. So we should, lots of these larger sites, we're not developing on the areas of most significant quality, so they can become part of green space, open space, and be part of the multifunctional green spaces. There's definitely a letter missing there. So after we've identified where the opportunities are, then we can begin to mitigate. But it's very clear in the guidance that compensation should be a last resort. We shouldn't just be going straight to offsetting the impacts. And even then, compensation should be on site. So this is the final step is the enhancement, and this is the bit where we get this concept of ecosystem resilience embedded. So enhancement is the bit where we try and secure and deliver measures before and during the construction, and try and make sure that we get this net benefit that we need. Examples of enhancement are things like back bricks and trying to design in planting into the suds ponds and drainage systems that will be required in the development. So the guidance does also say that we're trying wherever possible to build this in. We don't really want to be having 106 agreements and conditions to put in measures at the end of a development. It should be part of. And we also have got clear links between the AONB design guide and the other residential design guides to try and show at all different scales where these types of enhancement were required. A really key part is that because the guidance says we should be securing wherever possible, we need to be clear that this is only done where it's reasonable. So the SPG sets out for major developments and for smaller household developments where the council thinks that enhancement will be proportionate to the scale of the proposal. And the final section is understanding how we manage and monitor those measures that we want to integrate into the scheme. So this is something perhaps that hasn't been done all that effectively in the past, but we need to make sure that during the construction that we've got construction environmental management plans, and then following that we've got management plans set out so that we can secure the benefits over the long term. So the SPG is supported by a technical appendix, and that this is where we do all the signposting to a lot of the good guidance that's already out there by Chartered Institute of Ecological Management. Have got a lot of good practice on how to conduct a survey, or what we've also put in there where the ecological survey seasons are, and a developer checklist to help understand what surveys and assessments you might need for different types of development or where species are. I think that something that we've discovered through working with the SPG while it's been in draft is the importance of trying to integrate at different landscape scales. So at the large strategic site scale, we're looking at putting in corridors, new tree planting, connectivity, open space. But this was also being implemented at the street level. We're trying to make sure that everybody's got access to nature, to green space from all of them, from each residential property. And then even at the plot scale, a lot of the work we're doing on green infrastructure is showing how you can increase biodiversity and ecosystem resilience on or within the building or its immediate surrounds. So We have a consultation period which is ending on the 16th of October, and we are going out to a few groups to make presentations, virtual presentations. The consultation is also via a snap survey, so on our website, if you'd like to fill in the questions, we've got some targeted questions there where we would appreciate your response. And everything is available on our website on the link on the screen. So if you've got any questions, thanks, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Before we start the questions, I will just switch off the recording.